Hello and welcome to our another RigER webinar. Today we will talk about invoicing. We will overview the common types of invoices that are used on a regular basis by our current clients and see how they tie to different types of oilfield jobs. For those who are new to RigER, my name is Arsen. I will be your host for today's webinar. And today's agenda is to do a brief introduction of what invoicing is and how it's done in RigER, and talk about common types of invoices that we again see being used on a regular basis by our clients. So we'll talk about service invoices, rental invoices, billing cycles, which can be incorporated into your day-to-day jobs, and talk about invoice generation, how it can be a useful tool to do bulk invoice generation. And last but not least, we'll also a little bit talk about the multi-well allocation and what mechanisms we have in place. We'll close off with the revenue reports, a list of the reports that we have in our database and how you can utilize those to get a little bit more analytical information for your accounting purposes. So let's go ahead, move to another slide. So we all know that the invoicing in oil field can be from very simple to very complex, and can be either a service invoice or a single ticket invoice, which usually is not the case, and up to the point of having to allocate your revenue between different wells and having to define schedules for example, for batch drilling, so on and so forth. So it all starts within the rental service agreement, the job document, which is in short called RSA in RigER. So it also can include field tickets for service provision. We can include rental tickets to deploy return equipment alongside with service provision and consumables. It can also include sales tickets, repairs, and maintenance information. Again, batch drilling based on predefined schedule for drilling different wells and allocating equipment to those wells. We can include rental breaks and so on and so forth. And it all, at the end of the day, is going to flow into either one or several invoices, depending on how you generate those. And it will also incorporate information about obviously either the daily rental billing days or rental periods, the billing cycles for ongoing consecutive jobs, and it will also incorporate controls over the invoice requirements and use one of the main 5 invoice generation algorithms that we currently have in the database. So moving on to the next slide, we are going to see what actually generates revenue. And those things that generate revenue in RigER logic are called items. And in our case, those can be either simple ones, such as services, parts, consumables, or rental assets that you can utilize on day-to-day basis for every single job. Or you can have complex units, which can be built based on either one of this or in some of the all 3 type of simple items. So as obviously for service provision, we are going to use items of type service. For consumables, we can use parts of type materials and goods, and for rental equipment, obviously those are going to be rental units. The complex items, the example of complex items can be combo units, which, as the name suggests, are a combination of several units. We can also have assemblies, which are another type of combo units, which can be built prior to the job and kept that way for a long time and used in multiple jobs. And also we have packages, which also are another type of complex unit, which can incorporate not only items, consumables, services, but also will define the price as the sum of all the included items within the package. So how does the actual invoicing happen in RigER, and which information flows to invoice from what point? So the main key point in this diagram is to state that obviously we start the job with a quote and rental agreement. We have the dispatching side or operations side to create our tickets, deliver equipment, provide service, do service provision, maybe repairs, maybe maintenance, I don't know. In any case, do the job tickets. Then at the end of the job or in the middle of the job, when the billing cycle comes, to generate an invoice and obviously do it as fast as we can. So the main principle is that the quotes and rental agreements in conjunction define the prices for the job. We indicate the quantities and amounts of every single item that we include in the quote, be those rental equipment, be those services. And those prices at the end of the day will be used by the database to generate the invoice. On the other hand, the service, rental, repair, and other dates are defined within the tickets. So every single time we create a ticket for equipment deployment or service provision, those dates will be indicated in the database, and those dates will be the base for generating the invoice. So let's go ahead and move to our next slide and start discussing the types of invoices and what connection they have in the oil field and which type of jobs can be generated, which type of invoices can be generated for different various oil field jobs. So again, this is just an overview. We're not going to dive into much detail about each invoice, but we will see the glance, and those are the most common used invoice types that we currently see in our day-to-day basis. So service invoice first. It would be probably the most simplest, and it will be used for oil field service provision. In cases where your jobs do not include rental equipment, you just do a field ticket. Based on that field ticket, we will generate the service invoice. We can also have the rental invoice, obviously, for rental equipment and service invoice, service provision, and also consumables that can be included within the job inside the tickets. And depending on the actual job, the rental invoice can be either based on daily charges, daily rental charges, or we can also have different rental periods such as weekly, monthly, or others as defined in the system. And the rental invoice will be automatically generated on those rental period basis. Next is coming our repair invoice in cases where we do repairs as a result of on-site equipment damage, maybe by clients, maybe by our own personnel, but the main point is that we do repairs and we can invoice the repair charges to our clients. In some cases, we have seen that some single tickets, some single rental equipment deployment or service provision sometimes needs to have its own specific invoice. So we can also generate a specific invoice right from within the ticket and just provide that invoice to our client. For ongoing continuous oilfield jobs, we can define billing cycles in the system, 28 days, maybe a month, maybe 15 days, depending on what type of scheme you operate on. And based on those billing cycles, our invoices will be generated and will or will not include types of charges that fall under the current or do not fall under the current billing cycle. And probably the most complex type of invoices that we have incorporated in RigER is the multi-well allocation for revenue between, again, multiple wells, sublocations of one job. So we may have rental equipment, we may have service provision, we may have consumables, all belonging to one single job, but operating between several wells within one location. And at the end of the day, we might need to split the revenue between those wells and either evenly or allocated by portions. Okay, so let's go into a little bit more detail and discuss each case with a little bit more presentation. All right, so the oilfield service invoice and the oilfield service job. What we have in place is just the rental agreement or service agreement in this case, which is a document called RSA and represents the single job in RigER. Then we do create field tickets, which are the main documents used for service provision. And at the end of the day, we create our invoice, the service invoice, which allows us to include all the charges that were in one or many field tickets that we have created for this particular job. So this is how the actual service invoice looks in the database. This is the electronic form. It will list all the field tickets that we do for the particular job up to the point of when we select the date for the invoice. And it will also include, obviously, the quantities of service provision and the prices for each one of those. We can also assign, obviously, tax schemes, or maybe if our job is tax exempt or client is tax exempt, as seen in this case, we can define the ticket or the service invoice as tax exempt and no taxes will be calculated. Let's talk about rental invoices. So again, it all is going to start in the RSA, in the rental service agreement document. The equipment, the services, and the parts information are all going to be defined within the RSA. Then obviously we will create different types of delivery or rental tickets, as we call them in the database. So they can be either used to deliver equipment to client location, to do a service provision alongside with equipment delivery, or to return the actual pieces of assets that we have in location to our shops. Again, the prices are going to be defined within the RSA or the quote. The rental periods start and end dates are going to be defined within the tickets, and the quantities also are going to be defined within the tickets. And at the end of the day, we're going to generate the invoice, which will include the rental revenue from all the tickets up to the point of the invoice date. So let's go down. Again, this is the example of the rental invoice, which is based on daily charge. And by default, every single ticket in the database will be based on daily charges, daily rental charges for each item, unless we define that the job is going to use different rental periods, such as weeks and months, and so on and so forth. So in the background, we see the electronic form of the invoice. It shows our items, it shows our services and consumables in a different tab. It will show the start and end date of the actual rental period. And at the foreground on the right part of the screen, we do see the print form of the invoice, which will include obviously the rental charges, the service and consumable charges, alongside with the taxing information. Now, next is going to be our rental invoice, which is going to be based not on daily, but also on weekly and monthly probable rental periods, which we will need to have defined already in the database. The logic is going to be exactly the same up to the point where it comes to generate the invoice, because when we have the start and end date in the tickets, defined in the tickets, those pieces of information are going to be checked and verified to see whether those fall under the daily, weekly, or monthly rental periods. And after the check is done, the system is going to generate the invoice based on the calculation mechanism that we have in place. For example, we have let's say 5 days defined as a week, we have 20 days defined as a month. At the end of the day, the calculation is going to be done based on that. And in the next slide, we are going to see electronic form of the invoice, which is generated based on monthly charge. And in the middle section of the lower part of the screenshot, you can see that we have 62 days that are being invoiced based on the rental period, which is just a month. And the periods we are invoicing are 2. So this should give you an idea how we can identify whether our job is going to be generating rental revenue based on a daily basis, or we can utilize different types of rental periods, such as weekly and monthly charges. Let's go ahead and move on to see what billing cycles are and how they can be helpful when we're trying to invoice a continuous job. So basically what it is and what it's going to be is obviously ongoing and continuous rental job, which we have in place. And we have predefined billing cycles such as 28 days or monthly billing cycles. And based on those billing cycles, when we generate the invoice, the charges for the job that flow from the tickets will either go into the invoice or not go into the invoice. Now, if the charges are within the specified billing cycle, obviously we will invoice that. And if the charges fall short or are going to be after the specified billing cycle, the charges will not flow into the current generated invoice. A little bit more about invoice generation, what it is. It's specifically speaking, it is a tool in the database that will allow you to just use one click and generate all the possible invoices that can be sent out at this point, which will also provide you with the opportunity to understand which invoice belongs to which job and with a lot of information. So on the next screen, on the right part, we see our invoice generation tool. So we generate the invoices. We also have the opportunity to directly post all of those invoices in the database at the point of generation. And by posting, it means we activate those documents and those charges get to be active and already marked as invoiced in the system. Or you can check out the post invoices checkbox, which will allow you to go into each invoice directly, understand whether it's correct. Maybe you'd like to change something or add something, and then post the document itself. Invoice generation tool comes really handy when we try to invoice not only the regular service and rental invoices, but also invoices that are based on billing cycles and will be used for continuous jobs. So obviously we will have our billing date as defined in the date section of this screenshot. We will have the billing date, and we might have several jobs as shown in the top left corner of the screen that will overlap or be under the billing date section. And we may have several invoices that should be commencing or should already have been done at this point in time. So we select the billing date, and the system is going to verify if our jobs are, first of all, if our jobs apply for a billing cycle mechanism, and if they do, it's going to check if the billing date is over or before the billing cycles. So if we again have the charges that fall into the billing cycle itself, obviously we will be having to we will have the invoice generated. Otherwise, if our charges overlap the billing date, those charges and those invoices will not be generated because they will be generated on the next billing date. All right, let's go to our next screen and understand what mechanisms we do have in place for multi-well revenue allocation. And actually, we do have aside from the batch drilling mechanism and batch drilling invoicing, which technically speaking is having a predefined schedule within the job for every single well and have tickets and invoices ran based on that schedule. We, as a multi-well allocation, have two main mechanisms, which are going to be either multi-well invoice or master and sub invoice. First, let's discuss the multi-well invoice, which technically speaking will allow you to, excuse me, will allow you to list the wells within your RSA, within your rental service agreement, and based on that list, obviously do the service provision and equipment deployment to specific wells. And afterwards, when you generate the invoice, it will allow you to see the allocation between those wells and also list all the quantities, amounts, and services that were applicable for that particular period in time when you generate the invoice. So at the end of the day, basically speaking, multi-well invoice will allow you to allocate Your revenue may be split equally between all the wells that you have in the database for all the rental and service charges that you have identified for that specific period in time. Next, let's talk about the master and sub invoice. So master and sub invoice are is a little bit more complex mechanism that we have in place. It allows to have, first of all, a master invoice, which will include all the charges as the multi-well invoice does from all the wells that we have defined in the database. But at the end of the day, it will also have the sub invoices, which will include the charges based on the wells. How the system works is, first of all, we define the job to be as a multi-well job. Then we define the list of wells that will apply for this particular job. Obviously, we do our service provision, we do our rental equipment deployment, so on and so forth. Then we will need to define the allocation setup for wells, for the ones that we actually need to split or allocate the revenue between. So we can define multiple rules based either on by period allocation or by line item allocation. Those are really complex things to discuss right now, but the idea is that we have the opportunity to define our wells, define the type of the allocation we're going to work with, for example, pricing, and define the percentage of the allocation for each well. After we do this allocation, we also need to set the date or the time period rather that applies to this allocation setup. So we set up the actual allocation mechanism, we set the wells, and we set the time period. And based on the bulk of this information, the master invoice is generated, and also the sub invoices are going to be generated, which will include the charges that we allocated within this screen for each single well. And later on, it's going to be up to you to decide which one you actually would like to use and send to your clients. Okay, so let's go ahead and see the revenue reports. Well, the list of the revenue reports. You may already know that in RigER we have a ton of reports, actually more than 160 reports at this point in time, and a lot of dynamic dashboards that can be utilized. In this screen, you see the list of revenue reports highlighted, which can be used by your accounting department, by your team to understand what's going on and gain analytical insight on the aspects of the revenue and the invoicing. So for example, accrued revenue report is going to allow you to see what revenue you have pending and to be invoiced. The, for example, gap days report will allow you to, if you have batch drilling jobs, and if you're familiar with the batch drilling mechanism, sometimes when you do invoicing on batch drilling, you may have days or periods that have not been invoiced, and those are considered as gap days. The report will actually parse the database and see whether you have any periods in time or days that have not been invoiced, and allow you to identify those and maybe later on invoice if you'd like to. The revenue by clients periods will allow you to generate the report and see obviously which client generates the most revenue, or which time period you have the most revenue generation, so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, there are a lot of analytical tools that can help you to gain insight on the backbone of the database and see if you are doing good, great, or you need to work a little bit on your revenue side and invoicing side. I guess this is it for today. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. I hope you found this webinar informative. If you have any questions or would like to see more, just contact us and we'll discuss the details.